everybody. Just wanted to remind you all to stick around the main floor lobby after the event and enjoy some appies and complimentary beverages in celebration of University of Regina Press's 10-year anniversary. So yeah, exactly. Stick around. It's going to be good. They published some great stuff. Yeah. Our feature film will be at 7:30 tonight. It's called Brother. It's based on the award-winning book by the same name by David Cheriandi, who we had here a few years ago. This will be our last event in the May Wilson Theatre, as we'll be over at the Moose Jaw Event Center at 9 a.m. tomorrow. I wanted to take a minute to give a huge thanks to the team here at the Moose Jaw Cultural Center. So production manager Eric LaFrance, who's backstage, all of our techs, Matt Fraze and Derek Frost, front of house manager and artist liaison Jen Fraze, box office manager Janice Boley, marketing and community outreach coordinator Dan Mason, and financial clerk Wanda Reed. We also have our videographers from Lamp Black, Jeremy Ratzlaff and Liam McPaul. So thank you guys for all the hard work. I'd be in big trouble without this team. So today's much anticipated interview with Guy Gavriel Kay is generously sponsored by Visit Moose Jaw. So I'd like to invite the chair of Visit Moose Jaw and general manager of Temple Gardens Mineral Spa and Hotel, David Wood, onto stage to say a few words.
Well, thank you, everyone. I'm certainly not going to keep you here long. So I'm David Wood from Visit Moose Jaw, and we are a partnership of the local hotels and event centers. And our mission, our raison d'etre, is to bring new events to the city of Moose Jaw and to help to grow the existing events and festivals that we have. That is sporting events, corporate events, and indeed literary festivals, things like the Festival of Words, which has happened every year for 14 years. And seeing that festival grow is great for us as an organization. So I won't keep you any longer, and I'm sure you'll want to hear from Guy Gavriel Kay.
Hello, everybody. Are you enjoying the festival? Yeah. Yeah, it's so nice to be back. For those who don't know me, I'm Angie Abdou, daughter of Frank and Joanna Abdou, sister of Justin Abdou, Moose Javian, born and raised in Moose Jaw. And I love coming home to the festival. I've just been enjoying it so much. I've been down by the duck park where my grandma took me to feed the ducks. I've been in the library where I went to story time. I've been at the natatorium where I grew up swimming 2 to 4 hours a day. And I'm just soaking in all things Moose Jaw, including this beautiful festival. So thanks to everybody who makes the festival happen, including the audience and including especially Sarah Simison and team and all the board. It's really good to be back. I was getting ready today to introduce Guy Gavriel Kay, and I remembered this thing that happened in Cranbrook once. I was at the Key City Theatre, and the director of the theater barged onto stage. It was packed. Ian Tyson was playing. It was packed, and the director, the Cranbrook, Sarah Simison, barged onto stage, and she was in such a bad mood. She said, "You guys cannot just come out for the stars. Like, we have a theater we're trying to run, and we do all this acts, and you show up for the big guy, but what about all the other people who are trying to make it as artists, and how are we supposed to make it as a theater if you only show up for Ian Tyson?" And she tore a strip off them, and then she goes marching off, and then she comes back. She's like, "Oh, I forgot. Here's a man who needs no introduction, Ian Tyson." And she walks back, and Ian comes out nice and slow. He sits down with his guitar, and he's like, "Well, I've had a lot of introductions in my time, and that was one of them." So
that was no introduction.
No introduction. So Guy Gavriel Kay also needs no introduction, but he does deserve one, so I'm going to give him one. And we're about to have lots of words in the next hour. So I'm going to introduce him with numbers instead. He is 68 years old. He has 2 university degrees. He's written 15 novels, and not 15 skinny novels like Margaret Atwood writes, but 15 big novels. 1 book of poetry. His books have been translated into 30 languages. Try to even name 30 languages off the top of your head. He's won 1 Scales of Justice Award for the best media treatment of a legal issue. He's got 1 Order of Canada, which is the maximum number you can get. He's got more books, awards, and nomination for awards than I can count without making a big mistake. And he has countless lovers of his work, readers and fans all over the whole world. So please welcome Guy Gavriel Kay to Moose Jaw. So I did not know until I was preparing for this that you were from, I mean, I've known your work for over 30 years. My first husband was such a big fan, and he was a big, muscly wrestler who didn't read, but he read everything that you read. He'd read these big books, and I'm like, what are you reading? But it was all of your books. He loved them, and so then I started reading you, and I was a medievalist, so I love the historical spin. So I've been following you for 30 years, but I did not know you were from Saskatchewan. So the program says you're from Weyburn, but your stay in Weyburn was brief.
Weyburn was very brief. First of all, before I answer, first of all, thank you to Angie for doing this. This can be a thankless task and a challenging and demanding task to do on-stage interviews. It's not anything remotely effortless, but the good ones can make it look effortless. So thank you to you.
Thank you.
Thank you also to the festival. This is my third time here. We were looking into visits before COVID hit, and so this is the first opportunity since. You guys run a wonderful summer book festival. It's actually a pleasure to be here, and I mean that sincerely. And that's not just because we're adjacent to my birthplace. Weyburn was where my father, after my parents got married, took my mother for 2 years to make some money as a physician and surgeon right after she got back from overseas, and used that to buy a house in Winnipeg where they both grew up. So I was born in Weyburn, my middle brother was born in Weyburn. My joke, my easy joke, is that there's not a lot to do, so you can have children quickly when you're young and just married.
It's also very cold.
Yeah, yeah. They both curled. They both curled both winters they were there. But Winnipeg is how I identify myself. I was born in Weyburn, but I was raised and within Winnipeg through my undergraduate years. So I think of myself, I don't think this is uniquely Canadian, but I think it's got a large Canadian component. We tend to still think of ourselves as people of where we were raised. If you're from the Maritimes, if you've lived in Vancouver for 40 years, you're still a Maritimer.
Yeah.
I've been in Toronto since law school, which is a larger number than I like to try to remember in terms of years past, and I'm still a Winnipegger.
Yeah.
I don't think that changes.
I've lived in this place called Fernie, BC in the Rocky Mountains for 20 years at least, and I would never say Fernie's home or that I'm a mountain person. I'm a prairie girl, from Moose Jaw.
Yeah.
What do you think, what does that mean? So we talked about we're both prairie people. What does that mean in terms of sensibilities or personalities? And does it transfer into your work? Is there anything prairie about your work? It's not set in the prairies.
Question. That's a great question. I've answered it variously over the years, which keeps you awake if you do different approaches to answering. But one thing is that prairie people are stubborn.
Yep.
We're warm, we're friendly, we're never late. Winnipeggers are never late for meeting someone, especially in winter, because the person you're meeting may die if you're late, and you don't want to live the rest of your life with that on your conscience. But we're also, there's a resolution and a stubbornness in terms of worldview, and that showed up early for me in my writing career and certain decisions I made. After my first trilogy, when the Fianna Fáil Tapestry had done quite well, international sales, and the book world then wasn't so dissimilar from now in terms of agents and publishers want you to do to me again what you did to me before. Readers too, because agents and publishers are responding to what readers are indicating they want. And I said no. I wouldn't write my joke, I used it earlier today, with that I didn't believe in 4-volume trilogies. And the math doesn't work out. I wouldn't do another book in the same vein. So I shifted ground quite radically, both for myself and for what could be called the fantastic, the genre of the fantastic at the time, had not seen a book like Tigana turned out to be. And I can say this with confidence. This was at the time a painful story. Halfway through the writing of this very big book, which I began in Tuscany and kept writing back in Canada, halfway through, my agent at the time, a powerhouse, Stanley Colbert, said, "This is the cat's pajamas," or whatever phrase he preferred. He says, "I'm sending it out worldwide now on half the manuscript. We'll start with your existing British publisher," because they were my first publisher, and because the editor was someone who really loved my work in a very personal way. And he said, "I'm going to start the bidding at a multiple of X of what they paid for Fianna, because this is big."
How old are you when this is happening, so I can picture this?
Say that
How
again?
old were you when this
When
was happening?
Tapestry came out in my 30s. I was about 30, 1990, Tigana came out, so I was 35 when it came out. I
Young.
was 32 or 3 when
Yeah.
I was writing it. And Angie, I didn't even get an offer.
Oh, ouch.
Not even a lowball, not even we will suck it up and pay what we paid for the tapestry. I didn't get an offer from an editor who loved my work. And her explanation was, it's too different for the genre. And it's too big a concept. And I can't get our money people
That makes me
to
feel
come up.
sick.
Well, I have a memory. This is like, I'm telling a horror story. It's a personal horror story. I have a memory of going for a walk after getting informed of this into the evening in Toronto and calling one of my oldest friends from Winnipeg, an artist, Andy Patton, wonderful, magnificent artist. And he met me around midnight, and we walked for another couple of hours around his neighborhood because I was stabbed in the gut. You're halfway through a massive, risky book, and somebody won't even bid.
Did any of them say, "Come back when you're done, we want to see what it's like done," or they didn't even
Well,
say that?
this is the reason I was put in mind of it, talking about fairy stubbornness,
Yeah.
was that all you could do at that point is suck it up.
Or you could quit and do something else, but
I-
not a prairie
I could
person.
have quit, yeah. I
Not
wouldn't have been a
prairie-
good Winnipeg boy if I quit. And I kept going. I kept writing, blind, with nothing on the table. And the happy ending is that when the book was finished, Tigana was auctioned in 3 separate auctions, English language, worldwide, and made me a ridiculous amount of money from bidding wars in England, the States, Canada. Once editors had seen the finished book,
Then they changed their minds.
they changed their minds.
And you were still a young writer. You were still in your 30s. Yeah.
So what happened to me, though, was that I learned a bad lesson in a way. The lesson I learned was not to submit a book till it was finished. I didn't trust the editorial response on a partial. It's the wrong lesson because by the time that book sold and sold internationally, I could have.
Because then you were Guy Gavriel Kay
Well,
by
I
then.
wasn't yet, but I had shown that I could do
it.
different things.
That story speaks to me of how it's such a different thing, the market of publishing and the creative act of writing. And you opened your creative act of writing up to the market too soon, and you had done one thing that worked, and like you said, they wanted you to keep doing that again. But that's not that's not what you're in it for. You're in it for the artistry and the imagination and the.
Well, you know this very well too. The interface between art and creativity and books on sale at Indigo or your local indie or on Amazon it's not a seamless interface. There is a embedded conflict at times between the desire to do something substantial, ambitious, risky, and the desire to pay the mortgage. And every
And
artist
eat and boring things like
lives-
that.
Mhm.
Eating, yeah.
They live with that.
The other thing your story makes me want to ask about, and this was way later in my script, so I'm abandoning my script already, but I wanted to talk to you about your attitude towards genre, because like you said, you did a first thing and they pegged you as a certain kind of writer. Your second thing didn't fit in that mold. But I've also heard you don't like, I've read that you don't like the label of historical fantasy, yet people often call what you do that. So you don't like genre labels of any kind, or is there something you don't like about?
It's not as blunt as that, or I'd like to think I'm not as blunt as that. I probably am. But I find the way I'll come at this is that we are categorizing species. We like to label and sort and classify things. Movies, it's The Graduate meets The Godfather, or something like that. We like to find labels and sorts for almost anything. And in the book world, where we're on the marketing topic, that's probably what triggered it for you, publishers want to tell readers that if you liked Tom Clancy's last book, you're going to love Joe Shlabotnik's first novel. That it's in the same genre, category, space. Sometimes, whether or not it is. This is where the trap comes in, because if you seduce a reader into buying a book by saying it's exactly like J.R.R. Tolkien or Margaret Atwood, and it's not. It may be good. It may be a book they might have liked, but they bought it on what amounts not far from false pretenses. They feel misled. This isn't the way I thought it was going to be. So my resistance is partly because I didn't want publishers selling my books with analogies to writers that weren't true analogies. The other part of it was that over the years, my migration to being more interested in history and more engaged by historical research and riffing on themes of the past became more powerful for me than doing something that I had done, which was myth and legend and folklore. I was moving away from that, not abandoning it, but moving away from it. So the labeling thing started to make me uneasy about misleading readers. Historical fantasy became the best I could live with when they really wanted a label. And then somebody started saying, Kay founded or created the genre of historical fantasy, which is nonsense. But this is how marketing works. It's not the same, as you say, as writing.
Well, there's such
At all.
different things. I saw one reviewer describe your work as that you do a quarter turn towards fantasy.
Yeah.
So I thought it's more historical, but it's just a little shift towards fantasy.
I told Rob Wiersma that I would use it forever, and I would tend to give him credit when I used it. Because he put that in a review once a number of years ago.
I liked it as a
I liked
description.
it. I liked it.
I hear myself and other writers say that if a young writer has success too young, it's a disaster. It'll be bad for their career. Maybe we're just saying that because we're jealous when young writers have success really young. but you had success very young, and obviously your career did okay. You've done okay. So did your early success shape you in any ways?
Well, the story I just told is the cautionary note about that.
Yeah.
Because the first books did do well, but my decision at that time, we had no children at that point, my decision was to not build directly upon that, do something different. And so the success component is relative in terms of when it arrives. You know, there are writers who don't write their first novel till their 50s. You know, it's like Penelope Fitzgerald, who's one of my favorite writers.
I love her.
And
Yeah.
she's one of my very favorite writers. And her first book, her first novel, was written in her 50s. We sometimes overvalue precociousness. And sometimes, and this is to your point, writers can get trapped by precocious success. There's a phenomenon, I know you know this, the people who've had an explosively successful first novel, and then the second book gets shredded.
The second book
if
curse.
it's not bad,
Yeah.
or even if it's as good, because there's a I'm not your lapdog quality that comes into the critical apparatus that brought to bear on that second book. Yes, I raved about your first, but now I have some questions about the true level and depth of your talent. And you can be hurt by that. Now, the joke becomes, I'll take being hurt by a few million sales and I'll deal with what follows. But
Yeah.
it's an issue.
Yeah. Speaking of you not liking to be pigeonholed, I was very surprised. I didn't know that you wrote poetry, so I was very surprised to encounter your poetry book. And then it seems very different to me than your prose, and then it feels very personal and very about love and loss, and it really got me in the heart. Your poems really got me in the heart. And so I wonder why someone as massively successful as you would write poetry, which is notoriously hard to sell and notoriously hard to get an audience for. And so what drives you to write poetry, and what can you accomplish that you don't accomplish with your novels?
Angie, the best answer I'll give is that for decades now, everything I've written had been for public consumption. It was for the world. It was a novel that was going to be published. It was a speech I was going to deliver. It was an essay I had written on contract for some magazine or whatever. Everything was for sharing the world. And the poetry, which is why I began as a writer, the first publications, the first awards I won were for poetry, was never going to be sent out. I was writing it for myself. And then my evil publisher editor, I'm saying this with immense sarcastic font on because I adore her,
Nicole
Winstanley, who loves poetry, and with whom I'd made the terrible mistake of sharing some of it with her, some of mine, sent me many years back now a 3-book offer for the novel I was just finishing, the novel I would write next, and for a book of poetry between them. And I said, forgive me, what the hell? She said, it's time.
Oh, good for her.
I want to publish this. And that's how Beyond This Dark House came to be published. I would not have pitched it. I did not pitch it. I was happily writing poetry and rewriting because I was on no deadlines. There were no targets or destinations. It was simply writing that I could and did do for myself. You heard me this morning. I read a haiku in this morning, the first morning reading. And I will tell you that I have spent 30 plus years thinking through one word in that haiku and wondering if I got it right. And I'm still thinking about that now, because that's a very personal aspect, intimate aspect, to use your word, of the writing process for me. It's the love of working with words as well as I'm capable.
That story, I'm going to write Nicole a thank you letter today. I love that story. It makes me like her even more. That she send you a contract for something that you had no intention of ever publishing, and that she got that beautiful book out in the world. So when you talk about writing poetry, it makes me wonder how much of your day you spend writing. That's like, do you get up and do you write for fun and then write for work and then switch around, or how do you manage your different?
It's when I'm into a book, when I've finished the research phase, when I'm at the stop stalling phase, that I suffer from grad student syndrome, it's sometimes jokingly called, which is there's always one more article you can chase down. There's one more person who's the curator of the Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde in Denmark, and you have to talk to him before you can actually start writing your book.
Have to.
I did talk to him. But there gets to be a point where, again, if you're a Winnipegger and you're honest with yourself, you say you're stalling, you're avoiding, you're using the need for more background to avoid page one, word one. Once I'm at page one, word one, the novel is all-consuming in terms of my work for the most part. I'm lucky enough, and I'm very aware of that. We were talking about that backstage. I'm very aware of how much good fortune is embedded in the idea that I can just write my novels, that if I take on other projects, it's because I like the people, I like the idea, but I don't have to do that. And once I'm writing, it's more about word count for me. I'm one of those terrible people.
You write a certain number of pages a day? Yeah. How many?
And
What's
if
a magic number?
It slowed down. When I was younger, it was about 1,500. When I was younger, I was young.
Wow.
Now it would be somewhere, if I can do somewhere between 700 and 800 words a day, I
That
will
sounds more
feel that I've
reasonable.
earned my martini.
Yeah,
at
so
5
four
o'clock.
double-spaced
Yeah,
pages
yeah,
a day.
yeah,
That
something
sounds
like that.
more sensible.
Yeah.
That adds up pretty fast if you do it every day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Even
Yeah.
if it's a fat book, it
Yeah.
will get there.
Yeah.
Uh,
And you tend to
that's
do a
all I
book
do.
every 3 years. So you research for a year, and then you stall for a
writing.
year. No, and then
Yeah.
you write for a year.
I do not stall for a year, damn it. Don't let that get out there.
Well, we were here yesterday. Suzette Meyer said that she started as a poet and then went to novels, and she only writes novels now. So the parallel is interesting to me. And we talked about the way poetry is still sort of present in her novels. Is that the same for you? Is there anything about your poet practice that feeds into your novels?
Yeah. Poetry. I have done a lot of books with creative people as protagonists. I'm very interested in, this is a history thing, I'm very interested in the relationship between art and power. Now, if you
Yes,
think
you
about the
are.
Renaissance, and you think about Raphael and Michelangelo and Leonardo, and you don't have to go very far behind them or very far down in your reading to realize how much of what they did was a function of being an artist patronized by someone who could sustain and support their work. In some instances, that work became, this goes back even further, a panegyric for the wealthy person. You painted your patron worshiping Christ and Mary. You know, your patron was done as a portrait in the grand triptych. So I've written about artists a lot, in good part because I'm interested in that interface. In a few books, they've been poets or a song for Arbonne, they're actually troubadours. So they're poet singers in medieval Provence. And I love doing that. I love working with that interface, and I love, it doesn't make me feel I'm going to have to slow down. I love a point where I have to do a poem in the book that suits the time and place and the character writing that. I find that a writing challenge.
Yeah. I just right now had an epiphany. I realize why I love doing this with writers. And how many people do you sit down to talk to them about their jobs, and you can just tell how much they love what they do. It's a real blessing. And Cormac McCarthy said, to be happy, you need to find something you like to do for work and someone you like to live with. And most people only get one, but talking about your wife backstage, I can tell you got both. So congratulations.
Except I'm going to call you on it because my usual line is, I hate writing and I love having written.
That's Dorothy Parker's line.
Yeah, I stole it.
Yeah, we all steal it. It's true.
Writing is hell.
God.
Writing, I don't have to tell you this, if you're serious about what you do, painting is hell, music is hell. It's art, if you're serious and ambitious, forces you to confront your own inadequacy every damn day.
Yeah.
The idea that you're not as good as you need to be to make this character come alive. And then you stay at it and you stay at it and you hope that you did. So the actual process of writing, I've done panels with other writers and they've said, I love writing. And I said, I will kill you when this is over.
And that's why you have to have rules, like how many pages a day you need to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, same. I have to be really structured and set the time aside and have, like, you need to do 3 pages a day.
Graham Greene apparently used to count as he went and put a little tick mark after every 300 words. And his manuscripts were marked with little tick marks every 300. And I think he had to do, 2 tick marks a day, and then he was fine.
Then he was done. I was thinking about how there's this whole generation of writers inspired by Guy Gavriel Kay, and there's been a genre named after you, and there's still influence to come in future writers. And I was wondering, that made me wonder which writers inspired you. Who are your models? And I have some ideas, but I'd love to hear you talk about your predecessors.
Let me do a thing I do and come at this around the corner. I think we over-focus, especially with established writers, on who the writer influences were when they started out. My feeling has been for a very long time that our life influences us so much more than who we read when we were 14, and if we fell in love with, in my case, Dorothy Dunnett's historical fiction as a teenager. The course of your life, what happens to you, what happens to people you care about, people you find, people you lose, children you have, watching them grow up, all of these things, travel, the inability to travel during COVID, all of these things influence us, for me, vastly more than, say, I mentioned Penelope Fitzgerald as a favorite novelist, Patrick Modiano, the French Nobel laureate, I adore him. They don't influence me. They excite and engage. They may inspire me to work. When I was younger, I loved Dunnett. I loved Tolkien. When I was 11 or 12, I read The Lord of the Rings. Early Hemingway had an exaggerated influence on me. Robert Graves read young, nonfiction and fiction and poetry. Was an early influence. Yeats has been a lifelong influence. Yeats would probably be my talismanic poet. There's a Greek Nobel laureate named George Seferis, who I discovered as a teenager, and he's by my bed still, his work. Shakespeare. Shakespeare's in my first novels. Falstaff is in The Summer Tree. Henry V is in the prologue to Tigana. That the idea of figures falling into those templates or paradigms is very much a part of how I wrote those scenes. But the influential writers are not more important than the influential painters or Miles Davis blew a sketch of Spain when I was very young. And I'm not even musical by disposition, but certain things hit you and become a part of the inner apparatus of your nature. They're part of what you are, and that's what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I like that. So is there a difference between what influences the content of your work and the style of your work? Because I can see the way your life and all those things that you talk about would shape the content and what you're interested in and what you want to explore. Does it also shape the style, or is the style shaped more by other artists?
I honestly think that there's also, and this gets to be a really good, nuanced discussion that we won't have time for, but I think this is also a question of what stage are you at? I know writers, established, successful writers who will say they started off writing fanfic. And some of you might not know, fanfic is literally fiction by a young writer written in the style of, in homage to, an established writer they loved. And they couldn't create, they used the characters of the established writers. It's not just influenced by, they're writing a story or a novel in the world of.
What happens next, kind of, yeah.
Or who slept with who that the writer didn't talk about.
Right, like
There's
the
a lot of
subplot
that.
or
That's a
the
big part of it.
imagined
That's
plot.
a big part of it, yeah.
Yeah.
When you're young, whatever gets your pen moving, that's a dating way of putting it, whatever gets your fingers dancing on the keyboard, is a good thing.
Yeah.
And not everyone graduates beyond, but some do and become autonomous voices of their own. Once you're past that stage, a whole different kind of dialogue will take place. I mentioned earlier today that one of my dear friends said that I've become a poet of elegies, of loss. And I said, but that's because we've gotten older.
Yeah.
You do lose people, and you loved them, and they mattered to you. And when you're moved to put some words down, that may be very high on the, not the list, but on the hierarchy of what you want to say at that given moment. It changes when you get older.
I believe you. Yeah. I want to talk about all the seas of the world before we run out of time, but it's the third one in this world, but it's not. They don't need to be read as a trilogy. They can stand alone, right? All the seas of the world stands.
All of the books, the sequence?
No, all the seas of the world is part
Yes.
of a 3-book
Yes.
in the same world, but you don't need to read it as a
Right.
trilogy.
Right.
And so did you reuse that world? Like, because once you built a world, you're like, I'm going to use this again, or because you're particularly fascinated in that?
It's the latter. The Renaissance is inexhaustible for me in so many different ways. And I didn't plan to link all the seas in any way with the 2 books that preceded it. And they're not in chronology. They're not written chronologically. They don't unfold chronologically. They take place in that quarter turn to the fantastic of Italy and France and Morocco that I've worked with before. But I found something very different that I wanted to try to engage with. I put it that way a lot. It's not a story to tell. It's not a book to write. It's themes and people I want to engage with, because it's going to be a long time. I can't write a book. People are always saying, why don't you do Kiev and Rus? Or why don't you do the Incas? And it's as if I'm just cherry picking from history where we know there are interesting things that happened at a lot of times and places. I have to feel that I can bring value added,
Yeah.
that I have something that I can say and do with a time and place that hasn't been done. So I'm often interested in looking at less explored moments of history. The lines of Albasan in the early stages of the Spanish Reconquista, Byzantium, Constantinople, which gave me 2 novels that are a linked pair, because all the Byzantine historians I know, Angie, walk around with a dark cloud over their head because nobody knows anything about Byzantium. Even historically aware people don't actually know anything about late antiquity after the fall of Rome, when the center of the Western world as such moved east to Constantinople. And I thought, there's room here. I'm going to find something. So that was a book that purely started with reading about a time and place I knew next to nothing about.
That's
That
brave.
was a blank slate for me. I knew that Byzantine mothers blinded their children so they couldn't become the emperor if they didn't want them to. That's true in limited degree. I knew that they loved chariot racing.
And you became an expert in chariot
I
racing
I
for a
knew
little
the
while.
thing of mosaics, that mosaic was the art form of that time and place. And for all the seas of the world, I read some extraordinarily interesting things. I always put my main reading at the back of the book. There's always
A
a
reading
select bibliography if anybody wants to follow me along where I went. And I got fascinated by the nature of commerce in the 15th century, the opening up of the modern world as linked to Mediterranean commerce and as closed down by piracy, both ways, from the Christian world to the Muslim and the Muslim world to the Christian world. Pirates were the scourge of the Mediterranean. And then I started thinking about victims of that. And that dovetailed into images we were all living with in the last few years about small children dead on a beach trying to get to Greece, about capsized boats coming from Libya towards Italy, about people being displaced and dispossessed from their homes for a wide variety of reasons, a horrifying variety of reasons. And I thought I can do something with that. I can keep those balls in the air.
Yeah, and it's like, it feels very contemporary in the sense that it being about home that you can't get to, or home that you've been displaced from, and that's such a concern in the contemporary world. But I guess that's true of a lot of the best historical fiction, that it's doing something very of a period while it also comments on our world. I found this book so surprising. Like, it's exciting. There's pirates, and there's assassinations, and there's love, and there's sex, and it's just a lot going on. And right from the opening pages, you shocked me a little bit. I don't know if a Moose Jaw girl could even describe the opening pages. How many people have read this book? Isn't the opening shocking? So I'll say the word erection features very big in the opening pages. Very big. That wasn't meant to be a play on words, but it is. So it's, and I had a friend who runs the Pride readings in Fernie, read it with me. We did a little book club, and she said she really liked the way the book normalizes queerness. That's how she put it. It's not normalizes queerness. So it's not about being gay, and it's not a gay book, but there's sexuality is very fluid in it. The lead sometimes likes men, but she sometimes likes women. Some of the main characters are gay, and it's very strong women leads. And so in that way it feels, well, it doesn't feel political because it doesn't feel like you're going out to write a queer book, but yet these themes, it's just very accepting and very gay positive, we would say now. So is this something you're thinking about as you were writing, or is it something that emerged naturally?
Well, remember we were talking about how we live in our time? And certain things in our zeitgeist will enter our awareness both as people living in the world and as artists writing in the world. I don't do this as a political point. I'll back up a bit because it's a terrific topic. When I was younger, one of the things that flattered me most was women readers writing about or finding me at a conference and talking about how much they enjoyed or responded to strong female characters in the books. And I was saying, good job. And over the years, two things happened. One, I started thinking, God, there must be such a dearth.
Yes, there must be a reason
there
people
must
are
be
reacting.
A shortage, a dearth, a paucity, a lack of that from male writers. And the male writers I've enjoyed, for the most part, don't have that problem. Most, like Cormac McCarthy did. And I love Cormac McCarthy with awareness of what he didn't do.
Yeah.
But the other thing was, if my goal, and it is my goal, in part, is to keep you awake till 3 in the morning. And sadistically, when you've got a meeting at 7 o'clock the next morning, but you have to find out what happens next, that's part of it. One of the ways you keep people engaged intensely is with, for me, a multiplicity of engaging characters. And if you are offering the female characters as being engaging and complex in the same way, to the same degree as the male characters, you've got that much more to work with as a writer in holding your readers to 3 in the morning. So for me, Angie, it's really about trying to fuse the elements of telling a strong story and the characterizations of male, female, gay, bi, all of these elements are tools in the writer's toolbox, in a way. Not cynically so, but creatively so. What can I do? What can I use to hold you?
And you have to entertain yourself, too, to write a 500-page book. And I felt like your characters are so real. I felt like he probably likes them. He probably really likes Nadia, and he probably really likes... I felt like I could see you giggling as you were writing the opening scene with that I just mentioned, that I won't mention again. I only say that word once at readings. And I felt like, what is the role of comedy? Because I felt like I could see you laughing. Even though it's an intense scene with assassination and risk and all kinds of things, there's some comedy in it. Yes, and are you having fun when you're writing that? Are you deliberately trying to make the reader laugh, or does it emerge naturally?
Well, this is confession time. Nothing you ever say to me if you come up and get a book signed will please me more than if you say, that was really funny. I like being funny. I like making people laugh. I grew up with 2 extremely funny younger brothers, and it was a very competitive, joking household around the dinner table. I ended up with very dear friends who were and are very witty. Humor is, and I'm going to repeat myself, another tool. I think, not to get too technical about this, but you and I could get technical very easily. If a book is written on one note of intensity, whether it's high intensity or deliberately muted intensity, that's really tricky for readers. For me, the modulation of tone in the way you write, in the way the language unfolds, what the intensity of the language is central, especially if you're going to give them 500 pages. It's central to holding a reader's engagement, and humor will be a part of that. We're back to Shakespeare. One of the great moments in all of Shakespeare for me is the porter in Macbeth. It is a nothing scene. It is a brilliantly nothing scene. Macbeth has just killed the king, Duncan. Lady Macbeth has just gone upstairs to bloody the groom's faces and hands with the blood of the daggers. They go to bed, and there is a banging and knocking at the door of their castle in the morning. And we're waiting to see what happens after the murder of King Duncan. And what do we get? We get a miserably hungover porter at the gate doing an utterly asinine, he's suspended between still being drunk and hungover, which is not a pleasant state. An incredibly asinine monologue that can be stretched depending on the actor, and it was probably Will Kemp in Shakespeare's day who would have stretched everything. And it's got nothing to do with anything but be funny and delay the opening of the door. Delay what happens next for this interlude. And I bloody love that scene. I relish that scene because of the technical accomplishment it offers. So comedy, humor can do that for us.
And we both talked about how, as being on stage often, that we really like to get a laugh early because it relaxes us, because once the audience laughs, you're like, okay, they're with me. Like, we're going along, being responsive. There's energy going both ways. And,
you've done very well, by the way.
Yes, thank you. You held up your end. And I felt that with that scene in the book, that part of what made it so funny is that it's right away, you're like, just started this big book, and you're like, whoa, this has started. Or it wouldn't be maybe as funny coming later in the book, but it's the shock of it that's funny. I have so much more I want to ask you. I especially wanted to talk about Nadia and about slavery and about women in power and autonomy and how people have to sometimes work against their own character, develop seemingly negative characteristics in order to overcome power. And there's so much going on in this book, so I really encourage everybody to read it. I know we're out of time, if you can believe it, so it's your turn. You get to ask that's what called you Guy Vanderhay. That's how you know we're in Saskatchewan. Guy Gavriel Kay, whatever questions you want. And someone will bring around the mic. And I might repeat the questions for him as well, but you can ask with the mic, and then I will say them too. And the festival is winding down. Has everybody had a really good time? Yeah. I already can't wait for next year. Pardon?
Are we done?
Yep, someone's going to, they're bringing microphones. Okay, so we have a question right here. I should have brought my glasses. I can't see as well. We're quite a pair.
I was just wondering because I was at your talk earlier this afternoon, and you mentioned that you've always been interested pretty much your whole life in displacement, like displaced people. And I was just wondering if you could talk more about that and kind of, if you can, put into words like what that is that draws you to that theme in your work.
What are you interested in about displacement, and why is it in your work, and what is it that you have to say about displacement?
About displacement?
Yeah, what interests you?
Well, if I wanted to be flippant, I'd say you have to read the book. Because we were talking earlier about, this is relevant, we were talking earlier about how the standard question when you're on a book tour is for a radio or television interviewer who has not read the book to lean forward and say, so, what's your novel about? And it drives me crazy. I have never killed anyone. But,
He says.
who was it who said, was it Clarence Darrow, I've never murdered anyone, but there are many obituaries I've read with pleasure? A favorite line.
That's good.
Displacement, for me, one of the things that I can say about it, or I try to say, is to contextualize the grim reality of how many times and places through our history, through our known history, people have been exiled in one form or another from their homes, from their families, from their lives. And my personal interest in this most recent book was about how that doesn't go away. Even if you end up with a successful life by most measures, even if you are carrying on, being funny, being shrewd, that sense of original displacement lingers. And in all the seas of the world, that's a component of the book. There have been times and places in history where exile was in itself deadly. To be exiled was a death penalty because people were so dependent upon their kinship circle, upon family, that to be alone in the world left you paralytically vulnerable. Dante's words in the Divine Comedy, and I have these from memory in John Chardy's translation, and he wrote, when you're exiled, you will come to know how bitter as salt and stone is the bread of others, how hard the way that goes up and down stairs that never are your own.
Oh.
I gave myself bloody goosebumps
Yeah,
quoting
me
that.
too.
That's such great writing. That's such great writing. So this is something that inspires is the wrong word. I like to use the word engages because inspires makes it sound lofty and fun. Engages is it brings something to me and makes me want to bring something back. And I hope that's one of the things I can bring back to the question.
We have a question up here at the front. Oh, back there first, and then, yep. Blair, is that Blair?
Yeah, it's me. Hi. So I wanted to come back to something you said earlier about how people ask you, are you going to do a book about this or that? And you say you're waiting, you want to feel that you have something valuable to put into it. And so my question is there a particular setting or mythology or idea that you're interested in, but you haven't quite found a path to a real story yet?
Yeah, he was saying that you said that you tend to write about things that you want to explore or engage with, but are there any setting, myths, or history that you are interested in, but you've not yet found your story to engage with it?
That's a great question, too. And they fit. For example, I love Greek myth, Greek legend, the history of Greece, even the 19th century history of Greece, and something like the Theseus legend, but Bloody Mary Reynolds has nailed it to the wall perfectly. The King Must Die is one of my favorite novels. I will never write a book working with that because I'd be too aware of what she did. The Aztecs interested me at one point in history, and then I decided I hate them. So, do you know that the Aztecs used to make war on neighboring tribes with blunt instruments so that they wouldn't kill
Suffer.
the enemy soldiers, so they would have a sacrifice for the temple? They needed to bring them back alive. You were punished as a soldier if you killed the enemy because you needed to have them alive. And I'm really slandering the Aztecs on stage here. They calculated very carefully how many they would kill of the soldiers of various tribes, ringing them, because they wanted to give them 15, 20 years to breed back another generation that they could kill for sacrifice. It was tactical and strategic.
That's horrible.
Well, then if you want to be nice to them, I don't especially, but if you want to be nice to them, you will say they believed that mortality and death and suffering in the world was because blood had been stolen from the sun, and blood had to be given back in a sacrifice to the sun. And that was the only thing keeping the world and human beings from complete collapse. I learned this from Mexican friends one time I was down there. But over and above, and this is relevant to your question, over and above my evolving a dislike for them, was that a man named Gary Jennings, when I was young, had written a massive book called Aztec. And it was really engaging. It's a very sexy book, by the way. And it was a really engaging, whopping big historical fiction that made his fortune, and he never wrote a book as good again, by the way. That's a good discussion about one novel authors.
Yeah.
The authors who keep something going and the authors who do something transcendently great.
And then disappear.
And that's their book. That's their book. Richard Llewellyn, How Green Was My Valley, was one of my favorite novels when I was young. And I read about 6 other Llewellyn books. And God help me for saying this, none of them are worth the time. But a reread of How Green Was My Valley gets you in the heart.
I love the way you talk about literature. You can just see your passion for it. It's so exciting to hear, because some writers eventually only like talking about their own work, which is less. So I just love the way you talk about other people's work. You make me, every book you've talked about, you make me want to run out and read it. It's really beautiful.
Do you know the librarian critic Nancy Pearl? Does that name it? So Nancy Pearl is known as the rock star librarian, based in Seattle. She created Seattle Reads. I don't know if you knew this. She created Seattle Reads 25 years ago or something, which is what became and evolved into Canada Reads and everywhere else reads. She's in her 70s now. She just did Bosnia Reads.
Oh, wow.
She was sent over there to do Bosnia Reads with a novel. And Nancy opened the Ontario Library Association conference a number of years back as their keynote speaker guest, and they asked who you would like to interview you, and she said Guy Kay. And it was, Angie, it was glorious for me. You're reminding me of it with a pleasure in talking about books, because it had nothing to do with my work. She's interviewed me about my books on tour. This was 2 people who are thrilled by literature and books.
Talking about
Talking
books.
about books they loved.
I've said what I would love to do one day is a panel where great writers on the panel, but they're not allowed to talk about their own work.
Yeah.
They can only talk about other people's work. Wouldn't that
Yeah.
be fun? That's my idea, Sarah. Okay,
Suggestion
question right
for next
here.
year.
We have a question right here. We'll interrupt our little dialogue, sorry.
I'm sorry, this is not about books. When you first published, or before you first published your first novel, what was your definition of success? And has that definition changed
I was gonna
with the
ask that.
publication of more and more books?
When you first started writing, what was your definition of success? And has your definition changed throughout your career as you publish more and more
What a
books?
great question. What a great question. One of the sad things I'm going to tell all the young writers here is that the goalposts don't stay still. In the arts, the goalposts move. You're young and you're thinking, I would be so happy if I could write a novel, if I could write the end at the end of a manuscript, and I've done it. And I remember that feeling. First time I went to Crete to work, that was the book that was never published, but I wrote the end, and true confession time, when I finished, on the rooftop of my hotel, looking over the Libyan Sea on the south coast of Crete, I got up, I shouldn't be confessing this, and I let out a primal scream. Nobody might ever read that book. Nobody has ever read that book. But I had written and finished a novel. And then they move. You want people to like it. You may even want people to love it.
Yeah.
You may want somebody to want to take it on and sell it to a publisher. You may want a publisher to buy it. You may want readers to buy it and like it and maybe love it. And the goalposts keep moving. What I find interesting, it's a fabulous question because I haven't thought about this in this way before. As I've gotten older, the goalposts have internalized even more. They were always internal for me for a large degree. How do I feel about what this book does? And as I've gotten older, it's more about, did I do justice to the book and to myself? And I will hope that readers around the world share that feeling. But at this point, it's more internal than it was for a long time.
Yeah, that's great. We're out of time. I honestly can't believe it. That was the fastest hour of my entire life. So thank you all for being such a great audience, and thank you so much for sharing so generously, and thank you, Moose-Jaw, for having me again, and thanks. This is wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, you're very kind.